Okay, good morning. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started. So at present, I have the majority of your employment interviews graded. We've had a really busy time. We have a number of people who are interviewing for new faculty positions. So we've been slotting those in. So I apologize for the delay. I should have the remaining ones done after class today. So thanks for your patience. On that front, I want to let you know we are doing some initial interviews of some people who will be joining us potentially at EOU next year and teaching courses in communication studies. So if you're a major and minor and interested, stay tuned, since in hopefully a couple weeks, we will be bringing some people to campus who will be sharing, doing some teaching and talking a little bit about them. So I encourage you, as those things develop, you see those exciting opportunities to get to know some people that you might work with in the coming years. So let's go ahead and get started today. So last class, we talked about the employment interview feedback, some general things that went well and general things to continue to work on as you're thinking about employment interviews in your own life. In fact, there's somebody who contacted me before class, said they couldn't make it because they had a job interview. So we have a lot of ways you can really apply and use these things in real life. We also talked about the final interview options, the remainder of the schedule. I want to dedicate a little bit of time to discussing some of these options further and just finalizing and locking in what this will look like. So you have a picture of these last few weeks. And then we also spent some time last week getting into persuasive interviews, which again is one of those 4 options that you can indicate a preference for. So I'm not going to go over this again, but just know I offered some general feedback, things I noticed that went well and things to continue to work on for employment interviews in the future, as well as when you're thinking about your final interviews in the class. As a reminder, so I will be sharing the interview partnerships later today, just to make sure you all have enough time to figure out what you're interested in doing, and then also chance to work with your partners to develop and put together that work. So your partners will be posted to Canvas later today based on your preferences and interests. We also talked about some of the ideas here behind the persuasive interview, right? A persuasive interview is designed to convince somebody to do something, to believe something, to act on something in a particular way, whether it's encouraging somebody to come to college at EOU, encouraging somebody to join a team or club, encouraging someone to buy a product, right? There's a lot of different scenarios that one can be invited to persuade. And the purpose of asking questions is to understand somebody's comfort, their interests, their concerns as they are considering the option you're presenting relative to other options that they have available. So for today, our focus is going to be on counseling interviews, right? So counseling interviews are designed to explore providing forms of support to people, right? I recognize if you're choosing a counseling or health interview for this class, right? The goal is not to force you to disclose or share personal details and health-related concerns that you're not comfortable sharing in the class. You can use this counseling interview in other settings to talk about professional opportunities, goals, or trying to decide between a number of different topics or concerns. But you can choose a scenario that makes sense for you that you're willing to share and talk about in class. So we'll talk about some of the steps involved in counseling interviews and conducting those effectively. These are especially useful if you find yourself involved in a field that relates to advising, support. It doesn't mean you're becoming a professional counselor or therapist as much as it means that you're finding yourselves in professional roles that provide support, assurance, guidance, advising, mentorship, and collaboration with others. So there's a lot of broad applicability here to how counseling interviews can be used in real life. So I want to give you a few minutes on your own, just for those of you who haven't done so already, to complete the Google form for your interview preferences. If you have and you have a change or you feel differently from how you felt on Monday, you are also welcome to resubmit a newer version if you'd prefer. Also, if between the beginning of the quarter and now there has been a change to your availability, please resubmit the date availability form so that I know and I can make sure that I can slot you in with that in mind. So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that and just to review that and review the kind of interview you're interested in. And then after that, we will have a vote and finalize the schedule for the remaining class meetings. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Anybody else who needs some more time? Great. So last class, I presented a couple options that are designed to best support you in what the end of the term looks like and what timeline you might need, right? So you know that later today, you'll get information about your partnerships for your final interview, which means that you have a good amount of time for the rest of this week, and also knowing that we've got the Memorial Day off to prepare and to think about this type of interview. So with that being said, there are two options that you can choose from. Option A is to basically bump everything down a day. So the interviews would start on Friday, and then they would be all of the following week. This Wednesday would then be an extra day for you to prepare, plan, potentially work with your partner and gear up for giving that interview. Option B is to just stick with this schedule and then make this last Friday a day where you don't need to attend class. So how many people would prefer option A of bumping everything down a day? Raise your hand if you prefer that option. Okay. How many people would prefer option B of sticking to the schedule and having things end early on that Friday? Okay. So a pretty strong preference for that then. So what we will do is go ahead and stick with that. But I do want to make sure to honor your schedule with regard to the days that you mark as available. So I know that there was a preference for having that bumped back. What I can do then is just to account for that preference, have you in your partnership on one of the later days. That way, I think we make everybody happy. So thanks for letting me know. I appreciate that, and that should work. What we might do on this Friday, depending on how things go, is that might be a day where we have one of the candidates present in this class. If we do get that working for them to present in class on that last Friday, that would be an extra credit if you attend and participate in that class meeting. So TBD based on our timeline, but that might be what we do for that Friday. So thanks for letting me know. We'll stick to the schedule, and then this Friday with the attendance optional, which will give you time to work on the final paper due on the 15th. and extra credit if you want to do that in accordance with everything else that you have going on in your classes. Let me know if you have any other scheduling questions or needs as we're getting into the final weeks of the term. Again, we don't meet for the final exam period. Instead, that's a chance for you to prepare and submit your final reflections. So thank you for letting me know all about that. Okay, so today I want to take some time to talk a little bit about counseling interviews and things to expect, the use of an example of counseling style interview in light of questioning. And then I'll give you the chance to do a group attendance activity that gets into some of these ideas in more detail. So when we say a counseling interview, right, there's a few things that we need, right? If you think about counseling in a very broad sense, well, counseling deals with the idea that there is somebody who's dealing with some type of problem, crisis, issue, or concern, and the purpose of the interviewer is to help that person in resolving, dealing with, and addressing that concern, right? Both my parents were therapists, were counselors, had a lot of framework in terms of mental health and support, but again, it's not necessarily limited to mental health. Sometimes the problem or issue can be professional. Sometimes it can be, related to challenges in the workplace. Sometimes it's about setting goals and figuring out what somebody wants to do next. But in any case, right, typically the interviewee is in a position where they're seeking out help, and the purpose of the interviewer is to ask questions, to frame this discussion in a way that's designed to help the interviewee figure out and develop a path forward. So typically it's the interviewee who's seeking support, the interviewer who's qualified and able to provide what's needed. There are also times, though, where it makes sense for an interviewer to intervene and to initiate the style of interview. For instance, if they notice that there's a problem going on at work, we want to help that person in dealing with the problem. So again, one really key element of a counseling interview is that the interviewer is not necessarily prescribing or dictating a specific thing, right? That falls more in the world of persuasive interviews, where there's an end goal or thing that the interviewer wants the interviewee to do. So one important element of doing an effective counseling interview is that ultimately it's the interviewee who's figuring out the option. It's figuring out what they want to do, right? So if an interviewee is trying to decide, do I go to grad school or do I go to law school, right? The interviewer is not going to say, well, I think you should go to law school and here's why, and I'm going to make a case for why you should take law school. Maybe the interviewer comes to realize that that's the best option for them, but the purpose is to let the interviewee reach that position and decision at the end of the day in an independent way. Counseling interview, right, is also really about active listening and scaffolding, right? Scaffolding being the way in which the interview might change based on the dynamics of the conversation. We pick up on nonverbal communication, we use follow-up questions, we understand that perhaps what somebody initially presented and how they're feeling in the moment are two very different things. So being able to respect and account for the changes that somebody has as they're responding to a question. Maybe there's a question that's no longer relevant or significant. Adjusting the way that you give the interview is important. So that can mean really developing, the kind of choose your own adventure style of possible lines of questions based on the different ways that they respond, using follow-ups and probes to try to get into something more, and maybe having an interview that's very different than the things that you have overall prepared. Counseling interview, right? This does not necessarily mean that you are a qualified mental health professional. Again, counseling interview is not necessarily designed to provide clinical mental health counseling or other forms of care. Rather, it's somebody who is taking on this kind of advising and support role for a range of issues. So, you're not necessarily qualified to prescribe a solution to severe issues. However, you might be available as a resource and point of contact on a number of challenges that the interviewee is considering. So you might be familiar, we'll talk more about this in healthcare interviews too, right, with the Hippocratic Oath, right? Hippocratic Oath says, do no harm. This is something that more broadly applies to providing forms of support, right? The purpose is not to hurt the person, make things more challenging for the person, but instead to really focus on how we can make the interviewee feel supported and able to navigate these challenges. One of the most important things in an interview is establishing and maintaining trust. We've talked about this since the beginning of the quarter, right? You might be familiar with the 3 different levels we discussed, right? So there's this level 1, very superficial, level 2, starting to get into more details about somebody's personal life and experiences, and this 3rd level or tier that's really about the very personal, challenging, and kind of intimate details about somebody's life. That's hard to do in 6 to 8 minutes, but one of the things that you really want here is really getting to this 3rd level, or in some cases it works at the 2nd level, because you really are trying to dig in and really engage with some of the challenging issues or topics that the person is dealing with. I was listening to a recent episode of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on NPR, and it was kind of fun because they were talking about how friendships actually develop more strongly when people skip the small talk and like really get into dishing some of the challenging issues and topics. And, there's some truth to that, but also some truth to trying to make sure that that person feels comfortable and understands how their information is going to be used or shared. Sometimes we have this kind of parallel disclosure, right, where somebody like the interviewer is also sharing their experiences and challenges as a means of being relatable and not feeling like the interviewee is all on their own. So reciprocal disclosure, if you've taken a class like interpersonal or comm theory, right? Uncertainty reduction and other forms of communication theories tell us people are more likely to disclose and share challenges if we're disclosing too, right? That we are sharing our challenges and issues as a means of supporting them. So acting in the interviewee's best interest, right? It's not necessarily your job to, in a very kind of linear, close-ended way, know what their best interest is. But what somebody's best interest is changes, right? It's not your job to tell them, oh, you should go to law school, as much as it is to uncover the values, beliefs, and challenges that they're reckoning with to help the interviewee realize, oh, that's the best option. Another thing that's important is to understand your limitations. Sometimes you don't have the framework, the knowledge, or the expertise in the issue that the interviewee is choosing to share, right? I'll give you one silly example. Again, I grew up with therapist parents. When I was in middle school, on a whim, I decided I folded up a piece of construction paper and I wrote Ben's counseling service. And at one of the school tables at lunch, I guess I was like Lucy from Charlie Brown, where I was like just sitting there during lunch, and the vice principal came in and she was like, well, I've got these kids. I don't know what to do with them. What can I do to help? And suddenly I realized that being a 7th grader who decided to offer counseling in middle school lunch was not something I was qualified to do. Small world. So sometimes you have your limitations in your background, your perspective. And I think it's useful to acknowledge sometimes that you're an outsider. You don't necessarily come in with the knowledge of a particular thing, but that can be an advantage, right? I don't know anything about grad school or law school, but what I do know is you seem really passionate about, promoting support for ex-felons. This seems like a really good reason for you to pursue law school, right? So sometimes an outsider perspective is what somebody is looking for in a counseling interview, and that can be useful to gain that insight. Respecting diversity and boundaries, right? Depending upon the culture or background that you come from, sometimes people are far more or less comfortable disclosing and talking about particular challenges, right? For example, in a more collectivist culture, people are less likely to talk about themselves, their own achievements. They're more likely to talk about their relationships. And depending upon the culture, right, some people's boundaries, their level of comfort sharing issues is going to look different. I don't want to talk about this, I don't want to talk about these feelings or challenges, and being able to respect that person and those issues. As mentioned, Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. There's a line of questioning or issues where somebody is declining, they're not feeling comfortable in that. It's really useful for you to take a pause and shift gears, right? To suggest in a counseling interview, you don't have to answer all of these questions. If there's a line of questioning or response, it's getting too uncomfortable, you can end the interview or you can move on to a different topic. And then another good thing, again, over time, as you do more of these kinds of interviews, you tend to detect patterns in how people respond. So anticipating possible responses that somebody could get. For instance, if you're asking a question about, have you considered moving to a different location? And perhaps that they're concerned about the cost and issues related to a move, and you mentioned some possible solutions that could make that more formal for them. So, like before, you might think about, if they answer this way, these are some things that I could ask for follow-up on. So that can really help to make sure that there's good preparation and understanding of the interview structure. So if we think about some of the different styles of interviewing we've talked more generally about in this class, we've talked about both directive and non-directive approaches. So under a directive approach, it's the idea that somebody in an interview is establishing the parameters, right, the boundaries of the interview and possible solutions to address the topic or issue, right? So again, it might be a series of questions that I'm going to ask you in a more kind of universalized way. So you ask the same types of questions for each person that comes to this interview. And then a non-directive approach, there's a lot of ways that you can frame this. For example, an intake form, a survey, or just providing an overview in advance of the topics or issues that you aim to discuss. So sometimes a non-directive approach really lets the interviewee speak, right? There's sometimes a joke, right, about talk therapy or talk counseling where somebody goes to see a therapist, they talk for an hour, and then, the therapist doesn't say or do anything. And they're like, wow, I feel so much better. Thanks. Right. Sometimes interviewees feel a lot more comfortable when they have the space just to talk. So giving people the more non-directive chance to address their concerns can be really useful. In fact, a lot of counseling style interviews benefit from the funnel method, right? A lot of you use the reverse funnel or hourglass, particularly in your first interview, where you're starting with the demographics, the closed-ended questions, and you move on to broader ones. But this style of interview actually can work well the other way around, because an open-ended question is a way of figuring out the topics or concerns that the interviewee has, and then the interviewer can pinpoint and really try to crystallize those issues in greater detail. So sometimes that can be useful. And another thing to think about here, especially if you go with a non-directive approach, is how much do you want to cut off or end somebody who's talking. So, somebody's going on for 4 or 5 minutes about their life story, and then you realize, well, this is going a little bit from their goals and the things that they wanted to gain from this interview. So one of the challenges is to cut off people when it's appropriate to do so, and it does feel like it's getting off topic. So like before, you can commit to one of these two approaches or use a combination of them in the interview itself. So again, if you think about an interview, right, an interview is marked by a trajectory, marked by a series of questions, and sometimes the kind of direction that those questions take can look really different. You go in with expectations, with ideas about how things might go in the interview, but sometimes topics or issues come up that you don't expect. So there's a few things that can kind of show us the methods of developing an effective interview. One of them is about using an opening, right? An opening that's designed to engage in rapport, that's designed to show the interview's background, to show genuine interest and caring, right? Really helping that person feel comfortable, showing your attention and interest in them, and making sure that they understand, again, how information might or might not be used. Like before, a question should encourage self-disclosure. This is why starting with more open-ended questions, tell me what brought you here. Tell me some of the concerns that you're thinking about. Can be a really good way to get things started. And oftentimes, right, sometimes it's like taking a load up where somebody's like bringing like a backpack into an interview and you're helping them take off that backpack so that they feel comfortable. And the self-disclosure and initial anxieties are a great way for people to start to feel more comfortable. Listening for empathy, right? Being able to relate to, understand, or connect to the specific experiences that somebody is going through is really important. Remember that listening, right? The steps of the listening can involve really good nonverbal communication, nodding, using kind of a verbal response. Sometimes taking notes is appropriate, but really showing your attentiveness is important. Avoiding probes that are just based on curiosity, right? So one thing to think about here is that in this style of interview, it's easy to ask kind of question that is not really related to or has anything to do with their concerns, and then, I went through and I went to Lewis and Clark, and then I'm like, oh, I went to Lewis and Clark, right? Don't say that. Don't say like just a question or thought that has nothing to do with the topic or issue. Or, oh, did you like that concert? My daughter's thinking about going, right? So be careful about questions and probes that don't really relate to the topic or issue. Non-directive reactions, right? So one strategy a lot of people use in counseling types of interviews that's kind of funny is sometimes somebody will share a concern or anxiety and the interviewer just won't say anything. And then the interviewee continues and wants to fill in the space by sharing or disclosing something else. So sometimes non-directive reactions or using more neutral statements. If that sounds difficult, you might be familiar with the classic, how does that make you feel, right? Responses that are not designed to put somebody in a particular direction, but instead continue the open-endedness of questions can actually work really well. The close is really important, right? So sometimes in a more formal counseling interview, right, there is a time limit, and sometimes it's really important for people to protect that time, knowing that people tend to go overtime a lot. Yet I mentioned my dad was a therapist, and there were straight up some places like grocery stores and things that he didn't want to go to because he knew that his clients went there and that he would risk running into them. And every time he ran into a client, the client would want to like get free therapy from him and talk to him. So, sometimes establishing good boundaries on the part of an interviewer is important. You want to think carefully about how you close the interview, right? One really good way of doing this is to say, we're about out of time for today, but I would love to continue to talk with you about these issues and setting up another time to be able to discuss, to wrap up and kind of discuss the main things that we're kind of learned from that process, and to just show genuine care and interest in the person, right? Closing should not be like oh, well, I've got to run. Sounds like you've got a lot of concerns. Oh, well, sorry we couldn't get to them, right? Showing that empathy and concern for the other person, even if you're not able to get to certain topics or issues, is a really important thing to do. So as you're thinking about the interview trajectory, it should be designed to support the interviewee, help them feel comfortable, help them reach a kind of greater level of disclosure, right? You tend to learn more about and they gain more from reaching the sort of third tier. I wanted to share an example here of a counseling style interview, how this interview is being used. This is kind of as content warning, getting into issues related to social anxiety and concerns related to social anxiety. But I think this interview does a good job of showing how building good rapport, showing genuine care and interest is a good way of getting things started in the interview.
So I understand that you were referred to by your GP experiencing some anxiety difficulties. Yeah, I guess it comes down to like 5-6 years ago. Okay. I asked them that I just recently moved out from living in my parents, so I get a bit there. Is this the first time that you left home? Yeah, it's that time. So yeah, I'm going to give you a dad. Okay, so it's been quite a big step for the change. And it sounds like that was what led you to go to your GP. Yeah. So how has that changed things for you? It's kind of, I haven't really told anyone, so I mean, it's made it like better. I feel hopefully this is it, like it'll help, but I don't know, I don't like thinking that I have to do this, and I thought like really have to actually. How do you feel about being today? Just like scared, hopefully it will help. And so we did a little bit anxious about today. So I guess just going back to why you went to the GP and how you ended up kind of coming here today. So it sounds like you've been experiencing anxiety for quite a few years, but just recently you moved out of home for the first time, and that was what kind of led you to go to the GP. So how did that change things? How did things actually move out? I thought that they'd be better, but then I thought I'd have to kind of be independent and because I've just been kind of literally together draft on myself, which I always thought I'd like, but I don't actually like it. So what are the kind of difficulties that you have been experiencing? I mean, I'm a photographer, so I kind of, it's been stopping me a bit, my anxiety from being able to get work, and because every time, you know, there's an opportunity that is kind of involving you having to interact with people, I just have to just turn it down. So kind of making things hard in that respect, and friends-wise, and I think I feel like I'm kind of increasingly more alone.
So I wanted to share this clip because I think it does a good job of showing the steps of the interview trajectory, right? So you have this opening, and what you're seeing is this invitation towards self-disclosure, talking about the anxiety, talking about the fact that she had this chance to move and live alone, but kind of choosing to volunteer and share that moving alone has made her experience work, and she starts to explain why. One thing that you kind of see from this is that rather than just shift to a different topic or question, the use of a question like a follow-up is designed to continue that track and continue that line of disclosure. What other challenges have you been encountering in this situation? And then she mentioned some of the anxieties that she's encountering in social settings. So thinking about your line of questioning as taking something that you're learning about from this person and continuing to explore that topic is a really good strategy so that, you know, your line of questioning is moving into greater disclosure and greater comfort rather than starting to get there and then switching your topic or approach. And again, the use of listening of both verbal and nonverbal responses, showing care, showing interest is a really important way that that person is able to feel comfortable and included in the interview. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be about social anxiety, but it is about framing a topic that the interviewer is interested in discussing and exploring further and using a line of questioning that's designed to support that person in addressing those issues. So what I would like us to do now is we're going to take some time in groups. And for your attendance today, what I'm going to be asking that you do is to share, first of all, how you open and close a counseling interview. Think about some of the steps involved in building rapport and connection related to a counseling interview. Second of all, think about the kinds of questions that would be appropriate to ask in a counseling interview and the kinds of questions you should avoid, mentioning some of the ways that we've talked about curious probes and some lines of interviewing not being especially relevant to those issues. And then what do you see as an interviewer's role in a counseling interview? In other words, from your group's perspective, what should somebody be doing in that setting? So I'm going to split into groups, starting in the back here with Lily. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4. So take some time, have one person to write or type representing your group and chat about these questions. Be prepared to share your responses to them, and we will come back to talk about these things together.
Gather around.
Wait, are we splitting by like what number? I gave us a good way for the 4 of us, for like 5 or 4.
Yeah, so I'm splitting by groups. So within your group, you're addressing those 3 questions.
Wait, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then like.
That's what
The numbers do it together? Or like.
No, just like you guys.
I numbered, yeah, to be clear, I numbered you into groups. Each group is answering these 3 questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's.
It's all good. It's all good. It's busy time in the quarter. I understand.
All right, so.
Yeah, I was like.
We have 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get you this.
Oh, any ideas for?
Okay. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Like they do want to.
Well, you're here because of this. I feel would probably be the best way.
Yeah, I heard.
Oh, I. But you would want to be like biased. Well, Mr. Hopkins, why are you? What kind of, that kind of like, what type of person is that?
Unless they're big.
I was just saying.
This is not necessarily, obviously, you want to make it pretty big and then it's just like that.
Oh, yeah. Then you can see
That's
that.
Start making.
They're there. Yeah. I'm not going. They're there.
This is extreme steps.
Oh,
I would say like,
right.
Yeah.
I'm just ready to start off by numbers and so forth. Or we can do that if I gradually zooming on. Like starting off.
Yeah, well, that's the answer. That one. I think is what I'm most.
Yeah, I would love, yeah, like what we're.
Yeah.
And that actually. So let them open up to us. I said like, you know, if you want to make, you want to do like, open kind of questions, so let them apply, try to get more comfortable. And then after that, you can start.
Do you want to hear about that?
It's more.
And about like why they're here.
Style.
Yeah,
So there's more questions based on.
Right, they say, sure, they encourage some culture, engagement. What is needed?
Yeah.
Yeah. I do that.
It says try not directive reaction. So I guess.
What is this blue line? They do. What kind of questions? Are they?
Yeah.
Good one use?
Yes, yeah, it's a tricky balance. You gotta be able to wrap things up without, you know, making them. either
But there's a video,
bad or
right?
good.
Yes.
Okay, should probably do next one.
Hey, Richie. And I want to get everybody's names. No, you're good. Sorry. Bears or bears? Would it be? Silent P or like the rule there's.
Yeah, I know.
There's like, real, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you spell that?
And
I don't know what you would
Yeah.
need, I'll do like, I'm doing that in school.
Here.
And or in your.
So what is it? Sorry, say it again. I want to make sure I got it right.
Like that A and A, and also L-Y.
Okay, thank you. So what are some, what are some questions?
They're having a pronunciation. I was scared of that kind of thing for sure. I can do that. That's not even what they're thinking about.
Just say like,
Yeah,
like,
Basically,
relevant.
Yeah.
Like, what are-
Relevancy.
yeah.
You shouldn't see that we should live out of your comfort zone. You know, like. So it's you get to deal with things, but it's.
All right, so I got, what are some of the difficulties you're having in one of the other two?
Like how has that been?
About 5 more minutes or so to continue discussing, working together.
That way.
And also, I think
And then what question I think?
Avoid those curious.
Yeah, y'all know it.
Just curious. And then number 3, what do you see as the interviewer's role in the interview? What should they be doing? I feel like they should be going
Yeah.
So there you not necessarily.
Like be engaging with the interviewer to establish a relationship. And make the feel comfortable.
That was basically defined as. What should they be doing? Well, they've got to be actively trying to get the interviewee to deal with the issue.
Austin gave it.
Oh, sure.
Relax.
Yeah. That's what, yeah.
Oh, you should like to comment here. I did. I didn't mean to. There's a word on. What's
Take a couple more minutes to continue your discussion.
Right up.
Or like, yeah, John David.
And then ones that are usually avoided, it was ones that are off topic and ones that are.
We'll get that, we just had. Excess.
So take a minute to finish your work here and we'll talk about this together.
Oh.
I usually do that. So I'm like,
Hey, someone else volunteered.
I know, read that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's like.
I do, same time.
I can't. When I heard again. Oh, my. Let's really do two. That's it.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about things together a little bit. So first of all, how would you open or close the interview? Let's hear from this group on this side. What do you see as opening and closing strategies that work?
So we said, an opening check. We said that we had like, meeting improvers, but it has to be general plans to get them comfortable with you, the interviewer, and then once they give one questions about the topic.
Okay. What's an example of a general question you've asked?
Just kind of how they've been doing or how they've been doing, just like broad, very broad.
Okay.
To get them to kind of open you.
Sure.
Feedback.
About for closing over here.
So for closing, basically, we want to be careful in closing, be clear that you want to continue the conversation and the individual is important and their concerns are important. But as you gave the example earlier, it's like we're coming close on time, but I would love to continue this at another date.
Sure.
Excellent.
As far as the kinds of questions that are and are not appropriate, in this back corner here, what did you all say?
You said you want to avoid anything with bias or like tutorial subjects, unless like they bring up those subjects, then you can kind of go into them more. And that you could only ask questions that kind of like involve like what they're sharing and then kind of like build off what they're already sharing.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Expanding on or following up on a point that somebody has already shared. You mentioned X. Can you tell me more about it? Is a really good way to kind of follow the pulse of the interviewee. And up in this corner, what is the role of an interviewer?
The interviewer should be engaging positively with the interviewee to establish a relationship with them and make them feel comfortable. They shouldn't pry at the interviewee to make them uncomfortable.
Right. So it's the right amount of engagement. It's the interviewer like recognizing that how they might do something or how they might approach a topic is going to be very different than what an interviewee might do, right? You might make different choices. You might choose to do something else, but it's about having the space to respect the decision that the interviewee is choosing to make. So I appreciated your engagement and your thought on this. Again, this is a good option if you're interested in this style of interview. So to wrap up for today, we talked about counseling interviews, the way that involves careful engagement and thought of the experiences on both ends. Our final type of interview we'll be discussing in class before we transition into final interviews is the healthcare interview. So we'll be getting into that on Friday. And then we'll follow that option of keeping the existing schedule. So we won't meet on Memorial Day, but then after that, we'll get into final interviews. So look forward to a Canvas announcement after class with the interview partnerships and interview assignments. Please pass forward your email if you haven't already done so with the group member names. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all again for Friday's class.
Oh, right. Yeah, I can't remember.
What about we get the right track? That's all. How you're feeling, really how you're just feeling.